Okay, so let's think about conservation of woodland birds in a changing climate. And it's a project that's kept me entertained very much over the last few years. And it's a project that has very happily drawn in a lot of other people, and we'll be meeting some of those along the way. And many of the people, I think, listening in on the talk are the citizen scientists, the people who have seen various adverts for ways to join in with the project, and we'll see some of their results. And we're obviously very, very grateful for all the public support and help with collecting data in this lockdown year. Okay, so we're going to be thinking about woodlands and woodland birds in particular, and there's a group of three birds here: the pied flycatcher, the redstart, and the wood warbler, that are seen perhaps as three iconic woodland birds of the Welsh uplands, Welsh oak woodlands, and they're all long-distance migrants. They spend the winter far to the south. They'll leave Wales in the autumn. By Wales now, I'm of course also mean Greater Wales, including England. And as they migrate south, they might have a stopover in Spain or Portugal, maybe in North Africa. But then they cross the Sahara to spend the winter in the Sahel zone, or further south into the forested zone south of the Sahara. So they're long distance migrants. Although we think of these as Welsh birds that visit Africa for the winter, equally we could think of them as African birds that are visiting Wales in order to breed. And so when we're understanding what's happening to these birds, we do need an international perspective, of course. But these are birds that breed in places like this. These are some of the oak woodlands that form one of our main study sites in mid Wales at Coed Mount Bran, near Senny Bridge, Breconshire, which again, some of you will be very familiar with these places. So these species are going through population changes, and the three different species that we're going to focus on today have had rather different population trajectories. Two of them, the pied flycatcher and the wood warbler, have suffered quite severe population declines, especially from the mid-1990s until about 2005, 2010 or so. Whereas the redstart went through a population decline. This graph, if you note, starts around 1970 rather than 1995, longer time series of data available. Redstarts went through a decline in the 1970s that was associated with the droughts in the Sahel zone of Africa. And since then, they've made a fairly steady recovery. So redstarts in the UK, relatively common compared to the other species, 70 to 130,000 pairs. They're amber listed, so they're of less conservation concern, less acute conservation concern than the pied flycatcher, which is red listed, as is the wood warbler. The wood warbler is actually a fairly scarce bird in the UK these days, 6,000 to 7,000 pairs. 6,000 to 7,000 is about the number of people who turned up to Donald Trump's rally the other day. So, you know, not many wood warblers in the UK. And so to understand why pied flycatchers, for example, might be declining, we might also want to understand why wood warblers are declining, but why are redstarts, to a degree, recovering from a previous population crash. By looking at the differences between species, we can learn a lot, I think, about the mechanisms. Now, as I say, these three species are all classic, iconic species of the Welsh upland oak woodlands. And this is a typical scene in the Welsh uplands at the moment, or a few weeks ago when the bluebells were out. And this is the landscape, the native landscape really, for much of Britain. As the glaciers retreated 15,000 years or so ago, first of all we had tundra, and then colonization by scrub and then trees. And in this map we see the main vegetation zones of native vegetation, native trees in the UK. We can see that there are vast tracts of the UK which are primarily oak based in terms of the dominant vegetation. So we'll be talking quite a bit about what goes on in Wales, and Wales is primarily in this oak hazel zone of the UK. But that's not what the UK is covered with mainly these days. We've had a lot of habitat change through various causes, and human action, of course, is a really major cause of habitat change. And here we see from Google Earth a satellite view of present day part of Mid Wales. This is Llanfihangel Nant Bran. You can see the city centre here. And just up the road from the village of Llanfihangel Nant Bran is Coed Nant Bran Wood that I'll be talking about quite a lot. So here is a patch of ancient oak woodland, and within this oak woodland breed a lot of the pied flycatchers that we're studying at Cardiff University. There's also redstart surround and the occasional wood warbler too. And that's where the woodland is in the middle of Wales. So as well as human action on habitat, of course, we're living in an age of global climate change, and I'm sure we're all familiar with graphs like this. You can see, first of all, the solid black line shows the steadily increasing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that acts as effectively a warming blanket over the Earth. And that's been climbing steadily since the 1800s as a result of industrialization. And associated with that warming blankets, thickening blanket of carbon dioxide, temperature has been increasing as well. So we're all very aware of climate change as a future threat, but really the debate as to whether climate is changing as a result of human action is over. The question is, what does that mean for us here and now and into the future? So if we think about Wales, we can start to look at temperature data to see how has climate, temperature for example, been changing over recent decades. And here is part of the CHESS weather data, a national European scale set of weather data. And one of our PhD students, Mike Shuring, has extracted the temperature records for each of the large oak woodlands scattered across Wales. So each of these black dots is a large oak woodland across Wales. And if we plot the temperature, the average spring temperature in each year, each of the black dots is that year's average spring temperature. And the red line shows the long-term increase in those spring temperatures. So from 1960 to the present day, we've had already about a degree of global warming at the Welsh regional scale, national scale. But that warming hasn't been entirely uniform. You can see the individual black dots jump around from year to year. And the blue line is a sort of smooth moving average. You can see that we have an initial burst of temperature increase, then a slight cooling, increased cooling, and so on. So that's the average temperature change across the whole of Wales. We can look as well with that data set at geographical variation in temperature. So for example, as we go from the south up the latitudes to the north, so from the South Wales coast to the North Wales coast, you can see that spring temperature goes gradually downwards on average. Likewise, there's a longitudinal effect as well. The east of Wales is slightly cooler than the west of Wales. So across the map of Wales, there's quite a lot of temperature variation, but Wales is hilly, as we know, and there's also altitudinal variation, quite strong altitudinal variation in spring temperatures as well. So as we go from sea level, 0 meters above sea level, up into the mountains of Wales, then we see this on average drop in temperature. Oops. And that temperature drop itself depends on where you are in Wales. So further south, temperatures are on average warmer, but they still drop at the same rate as you go up mountains, as happens further north in Wales. So in other words, we can understand that the local temperatures will vary by geography, but also vary a lot between years. And so here we see the altitudinal effect, temperatures decreasing as you go up mountains, that looks very different in the coldest year in the record, 1963, compared to the warmest year in the record, which is 2014. So by understanding how global climate change is manifesting itself at the Welsh scale, we can start to ask questions about how does climate change affect these bird species that we're worrying about why their populations are crashing. And there's a whole body of biology research, in fact, that examines the mechanisms by which climate might affect animal populations. And this involves a really core idea called trophic mismatches. I've got a few little cartoon graphs here just to articulate the idea of what is a trophic mismatch. But in short, it's a mismatch between the time at which food is available for animals to eat and the time at which they need that food, particularly to feed to their offspring. So let's have a look in cartoon form at how climate change variables like air temperature or rainfall might affect the timing of oak bud burst. So when do the leaves burst out of the buds? Or as it's described in our house, when do the buds hatch? And then at what rate do the leaves grow? The leaves themselves then are eaten by very hungry caterpillars, as you can see here. And then those very hungry caterpillars are the food for the woodland birds that we're interested in conserving, including the pied flycatcher here. So when I was born in the 1970s, the very start of the 1970s, this is the sequence of events that we would have expected. So as spring developed, temperatures increase, and this line shows the amount of edible oak leaves for caterpillars to eat. And the blue line shows the emergence of caterpillars. Once food becomes available, then caterpillars start to emerge. And so there's a corresponding peak in the availability of caterpillars. And then the black line shows the nesting period of the pied flycatchers. So the flycatchers come back from Africa, hopefully in time to coincide with this real glut of caterpillars that the flycatchers can then feed to their chicks, and so the chicks grow well, survive to fledge, and join the breeding population. So that's what happens when things work well, but what happens in the present day is a little bit different because as a result primarily of warming spring temperatures, as we've seen in the previous set of graphs, then oak leaves are bursting their buds earlier, and the leaves are becoming available for caterpillars to eat rather earlier in the spring. As the oak leaves grow, they're fresh and tender and tasty for caterpillars to eat. As they continue to grow, they become quite tough and leathery. So as food availability for caterpillars, they become worse and worse. So oak leaf growth has become earlier over the recent decades. And the caterpillars as well have, to a degree, shifted earlier in the year to track that earlier oak leaf growth. And the flycatchers have shifted as well. But if you look at the positions of these peaks, the oak leaves have shifted a lot. The caterpillars have shifted earlier quite a lot as well. But the flycatchers have shifted earlier to a much lesser degree. So what we've got now is this situation where when there's a glut of caterpillars, the flycatchers haven't really started nesting properly. When the flycatchers are nesting in abundance, the number of caterpillars is really becoming very few because the palatability of the oak leaves has really declined once they've finished growing. So this is what we mean by trophic mismatch. There's a lag between when the food is available, when caterpillars are abundant in the oak woods, and when the flycatchers actually need lots of caterpillars to feed to their chicks. Now, there is a group of students led by Jez Smith, who's now a lecturer at University of South Wales, but until recently was a PhD student with us here at Cardiff University. He's now defected up the road to Pontypridd. And Jez and his team, Libby and Harriet, have the slightly bizarre occupation of measuring caterpillar abundance, not directly by counting caterpillars, but by, wait for it, collecting their poo, or frass as it's called. And here is a frass collector in one of our oak woods. It's just a little muslin square acting as a sieve. And the caterpillars are up in the canopy. And as they grow and munch the leaves, their poo gently rains down from the canopy and can be collected in these sieves. And it's broadly the consistency of little dried coffee granules, but obviously less tasty. So if you measure the amount of caterpillar poo raining down from the oak canopy, this is the kind of result that you get. This is the weight of caterpillar poo plotted against the date in the spring when this is being monitored. And the pale grey and the dark grey lines are for 2 different years, and you can see there's quite a sharp peak in the availability of caterpillars producing all of this poo, but the size of the peak and the exact timing of the peak differs between, in this case, 2016, which is the big peak, and 2017, which is the smaller peak. And those 2 lines are for a pure stand of oak wood up in Newbridge-on-Wye, Mid Wales. These dotted lines at the bottom are for mixed woodlands further south, just outside Cardiff, in fact. So you can see that the type of trees, especially if you have oak, gives a very big peak of caterpillars, and depending on where the oak woodland is as well, has a big effect on whether you get a peak at all, as well as there being between-year differences in when the timing of that peak happens. So this matters very much to pied flycatchers because they therefore need to time their breeding so that when their chicks are growing strongly, the flycatchers are able to forage on lots and lots of caterpillars during these peaks. But those peaks will vary in timing between the years. We know an awful lot about how pied flycatchers breed, their behaviour during breeding and their success at breeding, from a vast citizen science project coordinated by the British Trust for Ornithology. So these graphs are all graphs from the British Trust for Ornithology website. And we're not going to dwell very long on these, but just to illustrate the range of things that this citizen science enterprise based on bird ringing and bird surveying has told us. So here, for example, we can see that the laying date of pied flycatchers has got earlier over the years, from 1970 to the present day. It's got earlier by about 10 days. But the timing of oak leaf burst has got earlier by much more than 10 days. So there is a bit of a mismatch now going on. Can't quite see what that graph is saying. So this is clutch size. So clutch size, number of eggs laid has increased very slightly, not a huge amount. Number of fledglings produced has stayed pretty constant. And here's an interesting one. The adult survival, the probability, if you like, of an adult pied flycatcher flying off to Africa and coming back the next year has stayed as well, fairly stable at about 40%, 0.4. So what is causing the flycatcher decline? Well, one of the things that has increased and peaked as well at the time when flycatcher populations were decreasing very strongly is the rate at which pied flycatcher nests would fail during the chick stage. So this is a sign that something is going wrong perhaps at the chick stage, and running out of food in the form of caterpillars is a big candidate for what is going wrong there. So we know an awful lot about pied flycatchers. We know quite a lot as well about the other 2 species, of course, the redstart and the wood warbler. So redstarts have moved their laying dates forwards as well by about 15 days, so more than the flycatcher, whereas wood warblers have moved their laying dates forward by only about 5 days. So they've been less responsive than the redstarts, which are doing quite well in the UK, and the flycatchers are kind of intermediate between those 2 responses. Again, there are some changes in clutch size for the other 2 species as well. And we can see that redstarts have actually increased the number of fledglings per breeding attempt. There's been some variation in wood warblers as well. But we don't know some of these parameters for some of these other species. So pied flycatchers are very well studied, so we know what their overwinter survival is, for example. Redstarts and wood warbler, we have much less of an idea. But the way that we get those ideas about overwinter survival are through schemes, again, through the British Trust for Ornithology. They have a Retrapping Adults for Survival bird ringing scheme. And one of our PhD colleagues, Rich Facey, has one of these, or two of these retrapping adult survival schemes, one for blackbirds and one for the swallows that breed at Cardiff Riding School. But we certainly need more of these schemes for birds like the redstart and wood warbler to fully understand what's going on with their population changes. So what's the net result of all of these changes to pied flycatcher and redstart and warbler breeding biology? Well, not only is the population itself changing, but where those parts of the population are living are also changing. So here are results again from the British Trust for Ornithology for 3 different atlas periods: the end of the 1960s, end of the 1980s, and 2008 to 2011. And you can see that there is an overall contraction of the breeding range of pied flycatchers, which are becoming more confined to the uplands of Wales and parts of England and Scotland. Likewise, for the other 2 species, just as flycatchers have disappeared essentially from the southeast of England as a breeding species, we see the same sort of range contraction. Even for redstarts, which have increased over recent decades, their breeding range has actually become more northerly and westerly, and we're losing them again from the southeast. And a very similar pattern is seen with the wood warbler, which has undergone already a population crash. So it's decreasing numbers, but also decreasing range within the UK. So what can this information about trophic mismatches and all that breeding information tell us about why these changes are occurring? Well, it turns out that we can quite readily measure these trophic mismatches by not just collecting caterpillar poo, which is a very bizarre activity that Jez Smith takes part in, but more normal people can do things like measuring oak leaf growth. And you can see quite big differences in oak leaf growth by going around the country and collecting oak leaves. These are oak twigs collected on the same day from Senny Bridge near Nantbran Wood up in the Brecon Beacons. This is a high altitude location, relatively far north. Brecon is a little bit lower altitude. You can see that the oak leaves are a little bit more advanced in their growth. Caerphilly Mountain, it's relatively high altitude, but further south, see the oak leaf growth is a bit more advanced again. And here are some oak leaves from the coast at Cardiff. So it's both low altitude, sea level essentially, and low latitude, so far south of Wales. And you can see that there's a vast difference in oak leaf growth on a single day. So it's quite possible that these differences in oak leaf growth have knock-on consequences for the timing of availability of caterpillars in the oak woods at the critical moments in the breeding season when flycatchers need vast numbers of caterpillars to feed their rapidly growing chicks. So this is where over the last 5 years, I've been wandering around the lanes of Wales collecting oak leaves with various partners in crime. And here is Deji Bolade from Nigeria, who came on a placement this time last year. And we had many happy trips up to mid Wales and back collecting oak leaves. It's not a very complicated method. It's just measuring with a 15-centimeter ruler the maximum length of the oak leaf, but it provides a very doable, very easy to understand measure of oak leaf growth at any particular time. Of course, then in 2020, we had the lockdown, and meant that I or nobody else could go collecting oak leaves. And that led to a little video appeal on YouTube, and then various tweets and Facebook posts asking people from across the UK to go out on our behalf and collect oak leaves from their local oak trees, and then post them back to my address in Cardiff. And that has been going on over the last few weeks. Our postman is completely mystified by what is happening. But we've had a massive response, fantastic response. This map is actually a little bit out of date, but it shows the distribution of at least the first set of oak leaf collections. And so we're able, across this time now at the scale of the whole UK, to look at how oak leaf growth depends on altitude, how high up or down in altitude, latitude, how far north or south, and also longitude, where east or west are the oak trees growing. So by doing that, we can plot graphs like the leaf length on different days of the year. And so you can see the black line shows the growth curve, if you like. This is a growth curve for oak leaves in mid-Wales. So that's the seasonal change in the size of oak leaves, and flycatchers need oak leaves to be relatively small when they're breeding so that they are soft and tender for caterpillars to eat, and so there's lots of caterpillars for the flycatchers to feed to their chicks. But what we can see here is that leaf length varies geographically, so it leaves are longer on any particular day at sea level compared to high up in the Brecon Beacons, for example, or high up in Snowdonia or the Cairngorms. So there's an altitudinal effect. Leaf length, in effect, is later at high altitudes. Likewise, leaf length is later further north, and leaf length varies a lot between years. And we can see that 2020 is quite an unusual year because it was so warm early in spring in the UK, then oak leaves started growing very early. And so both in terms of how long leaves were on the 1st of May or the 30th of May, they're significantly more well grown this year than they have been in any of the previous 4 years. So huge thanks to all the people who have joined in with that part of the project, and that is very much ongoing. Here's a photo of my desk at home. This is my current backlog of oak leaf packages yet to be measured. Counted them just before the talk. The backlog is 50 packages, so your thoughts and prayers will be very welcome there. Okay, so as well as average temperatures mattering, there are other things that matter, not least late spring frosts can damage oak leaves and either kill them directly or stall their growth. And what we can see here, this is a plot of the minimum temperatures, so the minimum overnight temperatures in Senny Bridge near Coednant Bran, over 5 different years. So these are the 5 years when we'd be measuring oak leaf growth at Nant Bran and elsewhere. And you can see that in April and May, there are actually quite regular dips down below -2 degrees Celsius. So these late spring frosts are quite regular in parts of Wales and other parts of the rest of the UK as well. And the effects of that are to either kill oak leaves directly, so you see lots of dead oak growth with some surviving leaves that are still growing. But also we found that it can cause multiple kind of staggered starts of oak leaf growth. So these are dark green oak leaves that won't be very palatable to caterpillars anymore. But on the same tree, on the same branch, even on the same twig, we see these much later growing leaves that are replacing oak leaves killed by frost. And you can see some of the frost damaged dead leaves around that new growth. So this is something that we're looking into at the moment, that these late spring frosts might be good or bad for flycatchers, depending on exactly when they occur in that phase of critical phase of oak leaf growth. And the backlog of envelopes containing oak leaves still to be measured will hopefully shed a lot of light on that geographical spread of frost damage, which this year was quite extensive in Wales and beyond. Okay, so as a result of all that measuring of oak leaves, we're able, of course, to predict the stage of oak leaf growth across Wales on a particular date, at a particular altitude, particular latitude and longitude. And so we can map out the phenology, the timing, if you like, of oak leaf growth at a Welsh scale or even now a UK scale. So on these maps, the darker the green is, more intense the green, the earlier oak leaves are starting to grow. So it's the paler areas of Wales or the UK that are best for flycatchers because oak leaf growth is later. So by the time flycatchers come back from Africa, lay their eggs, hatch their chicks, then there are still caterpillars available in the oak woodlands for them to eat. As well as using 15-centimetre rulers, some of the research group are much more high-tech and use satellites to measure oak leaf growth. Here is satellite data extracted by Mike Shuring, one of our PhD students. Here's Mike looking longingly at the Welsh uplands, which we still can't access. And this is a graph of some of that satellite-derived data. Again, looking with satellites at the greenness of each of these large oak woods within Wales. And here we have the annual cycle of greenness. Over the winter, it's not very green. And then we have this green wave beginning in spring, leveling off over the summer and declining in autumn. And so we can use these satellite measurements to look not just across 5 years, but across 30 years, I think it is, at how climate has changed and how the timing of oak leaf growth has varied across those 30 odd years. These are the locations in terms of altitude above sea level of these large oak woodlands in Wales. You can see that large oak woodlands are a middle altitude phenomenon. There aren't that many at sea level. There aren't that many at the tops of mountains either. There aren't any at the tops of mountains in Wales. But there is a lot of altitudinal space, land area, where we don't yet have oak woods that is available for oak woods to grow. And so we'll come back to that idea later on. So what we'll focus on is just this spring greening, this green wave of leaf growth. And again, we can look at geographical variation in this greenness. NDVI just stands for Normal Difference Vegetation Index, or greenness is a shorthand way of saying that. So here's the spring growth, gets greener over time in spring. We can see that the timing of that green wave varies between the years, and this blue line shows the overall increase in greenness on the 1st of May. So the timing of spring in terms of oak leaf growth is getting earlier and earlier from 1984, the first year of the study, to 2020. And this is using satellite data, remember. Again, we can also, with satellite data, detect the altitudinal difference in greenness. So it's less green at higher altitudes on the 1st of May, and it's less green further north on the 1st of May. So again, where you are in Wales, how high up or down mountains, whether you're north or south, matters a lot in terms of when leaves are suitable to sustain caterpillars and when caterpillars are available for flycatchers. So with this mapping and looking at change over time, we can project forwards in time to look again at the distribution of and the timing of oak leaf growth across Wales into the future, as well as in the past. So again, darker means later leaf growth. And so these darker areas this time are more suitable for pied flycatchers because the leaf growth is later. But as you can see, the present day, the greenness is more intense, so there's fewer dark areas. So less of Wales is suitable for flycatchers to breed. And as we go forwards in time to the end of the century, then the greenness is much, much brighter. So less of the Welsh landscape is suitable for flycatchers to breed in. As well as satellites, another little bit of technology here used by Jim Viffidis, another former PhD student, now a lecturer at the University of the West of England. And if we nip over to Facebook, here is one of Jim's drones flying over an oak woodland. It's actually one of the highest oak woodlands in Wales at Cardiff University in the Brecon Beacons. In the background, you can hear my dog, Tommy Thomas, being very excited about this strange flying machine. Okay, so Jim there was flying a drone over various woodlands, different altitudes, different latitudes, and measuring, again from photography, the greenness of the canopy. And we can see here that the red dots, which are the average greenness at the different sites, show that there's quite a lot of variation between sites, as we've seen from the other parts of the project. But also the blue dots show the greenness of individual trees and individual oak trees within each site. So at this site, well, let's look at site 6. This is Cardiff University, high up in the Brecon Beacons. The greenness is incredibly variable around that average. So birds actually have a lot of choice, depending on which trees they breed near, as to how advanced or retarded oak leaf growth will be when they're rearing their chicks. So we might expect birds to be choosing at a very, very local scale which trees to breed near to. Okay, so back to the flycatchers. What does all this mean for them? Well, we can use the atlas data from the British Trust for Ornithology and other atlas data, like here is a tree atlas data set, to predict where should flycatchers breed or not breed, depending on things to do with temperature or influence temperature, like latitude, longitude, and altitude, the predicted leaf length at a critical stage in the spring, and whether there are oaks present or absent at that location in the first place. So if you model pied flycatcher distribution and map that out on a map of Britain, the grey shaded areas are where the model predicts flycatchers should live. And as you can see, that's quite a close match to the blue dots, which is where pied flycatchers actually live. So using only latitude, longitude, altitude, leaf length, and the presence or absence of oaks, we actually have a very good mechanistic understanding here of why flycatchers live in some places and don't live in others. And if we look at the leaf length effect, here we've got leaf length on May the 1st plotted against the probability of having pied flycatchers breeding or not breeding in any of these grid squares in the UK. And you can see that there's this very steep drop off in the probability of having flycatchers when leaf lengths are less than 4 centimetres on the 1st of May. Then there's a very high probability of having flycatchers present. You're almost certain to have flycatchers present. But if leaf length is greater than 6 centimetres on the 1st of May, you're almost certain not to have pied flycatchers present. And the shape of that relationship also depends a little bit on what species of oaks are present as well. So sessile oak is the main upland oak of the northwest of Britain, and having sessile oaks present increases the probability of having flycatchers present as well. So this is a lot of ongoing work by one of our master's students, Molly Laban, and Molly claims to be very camera shy, so I don't have a photo of her for the presentation. So she's represented here by a flycatcher, which is her main study species. But a lot of hard work from Molly extracting and analysing data has gone into these maps and graphs. We can also do that for not just flycatchers, but for the other species, the redstart and the wood warbler. And the results for wood warblers are very similar to pied flycatchers. If leaf lengths on May the 1st are greater than 6 centimetres, you're very unlikely to have wood warblers present. And the lower threshold where you start to get a very high probability of having wood warblers is if leaf lengths are less than 2 or 3 centimetres on May the 1st. So wood warblers seem to be needing shorter leaves, newer leaves, if you like, for their breeding timing. But the result is very different for redstarts. There's very little effect of leaf length on the probability of having redstarts presence or absence. And this gives us an insight into the biology of the birds. It seems from these graphs that pied flycatchers and wood warblers are much more strongly dependent on the presence and the timing of oak leaf growth than redstarts are. And I guess for bird watchers among us, it makes a lot of sense. Redstarts are birds perhaps more of the edges of woodlands and the kind of scrubby, free type habitats at the uphill fringes of Welsh oak woodlands, whereas pied flycatchers and wood warblers perhaps are birds more of the pure stands of oak and the interior of woodlands. So just to finish up now, what does this all mean for how to do anything about the conservation of these native woodland birds in a changing climate? We've seen that we've had about a degree of climate warming in Wales already. And in changing landscapes, we've had a lot of deforestation across the British Isles over thousands of years. But we have decisions approaching as to how to use our landscapes in the future, perhaps as hill farming becomes less and less economical for economic reasons. We might have decisions about how the uplands are best used for society. So it's my bird clock singing again with very bad batteries. So we have decisions about where this is a great tick with its batteries running out. Apologies for our clock. So we found from the results that flycatchers and wood warblers are very strongly dependent on the timing of oak leaf growth. And so clearly these species need oak woodlands that have leaves growing later in the season. So where do we find oak woodlands that have leaves growing later in the season? Well, of course, it's at higher altitudes and higher latitudes. And if you remember, this is the distribution of existing oak woodlands in Wales, large oak woodlands over 10 hectares. And the blue distribution is the altitudinal distribution of available land cover. So there's a lot of upland that doesn't have oak woodland at the moment, which potentially are the places, high altitudes and at high latitudes, these are the places where new oak woodlands potentially have much later leaf growth, as we've seen due to the geographical variation in oak leaf phenology. So those are the kinds of places where oak woodlands would be of most benefit to these two species, whereas for redstarts, that seems to matter much less. And of course, we are currently facing lots of decisions about how to use the landscape, as I was saying. And if you remember in the last general election, there was almost an arms race of promises of the different parties promising to plant differing numbers of trees over different timescales. And a big message from all of that is that tree planting can be bad as well as good. And we need to have the right trees in the right places. And studies like this, I think, illustrate what it means to have the right trees, so native woodland trees, including oak, in the right places can involve decisions about what do we want these woodlands for? Do we want them solely for carbon capture? Or do we want them also to play a role in the conservation of native woodland birds? And the insights that we've got now from the British Trust for Ornithology data, from the Oak Leaf Citizen Science Project, narrows down the options of where are the best places to plant new oak woodlands for future conservation of these long-distance migrant birds. Okay, so I think I'll stop there, and if I go to stop share, then Frank, are you back on here?
Hello. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I mean it's 3 o'clock, but I mean, this being online, if people need to go, they can of course go. But I think if you're happy, then we've definitely got time for questions.
Sure.
And I would suggest that you just turn on your microphones and start asking, and if people start talking into each other, then we'll have to find out a way to prioritize.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can jump in here. That was a great talk, Rob. Thank you so much, and really interesting research. I really like all the different components, and yeah, just love thinking about how these species are being affected. You know, obviously multiple different locations and the phenology component. So I think about phenology a lot, and I also think about forest structure a lot. And so I sort of have quite a few questions for you, thinking about, you know, whether there are, you know, significant variations in microclimate in the oak canopies where these birds nest. And I don't know to what extent that's true, but, you know, there's a lot of research, especially coming out of David Coombs's lab at University of Cambridge, particularly Florian Zellweger, really cool work looking at how there can be microclimatic refugia. So I'm wondering whether, you know, there could be kind of lower levels in the canopy where that might be actually better, you know, more suitable habitat. The leaves might not be so, you know, developed so early on, and whether that could be a cool kind of aspect to investigate.
Yeah, thanks, Marielle. Marielle's done a lot of work on tree growth and phenology, and yeah, I think that's very likely to be the case with the flycatchers and foraging in oak trees, where, for example, with the frost damage, that is patchy even within a single tree. So the tops of canopies tend to be frostbitten a lot more than the kind of sub-stories of the canopy. And so there's a real 3D patchwork of opportunities for flycatchers then to forage on leaves with or without frost damage, or leaves of different ages coming through after a frost damage event has knocked them back. And then some of the drone work with James Fiddis showing that at the scale of an individual wood, from tree to tree, there are big differences as well in how green they are at different stages of the season.
A quick one for me. One thing to note is that since we're recording this, we will also record all the questions. So some of you might be submitting comments or things that Rob may or may not have time to answer today. So he will have a written record. Sorry, Rob. And just to pick up on one, you got a question about if you still want measurements of oak leaves, for example, from North Cardiff, from Peter Anderson.
Hi, Pete. Well, I think for next year, yes, please. For this year, it's really the far north of Scotland now that is the main priority, because further south, oh, hi Pete, further south, oak leaf growth is pretty much finished now. So we're just following the green wave up to Orkney is our most northerly point at the moment. Oh, Pete, I think you're on mute, but yeah.
Hi, Rob, can I ask one?
Yeah, sure. And
hi, Rob. Hi, Julian here. Julian Hughes. That was brilliant. Really, really good. Really clear. And the way you weave together the various studies that your students have done is just fantastic. I was particularly interested in Molly Laban's NSC work. I think there's some really fantastic stuff in there. Just thinking about, obviously, where you finished off, obviously, is about those kind of decisions Wales needs to make about where trees go. And there's some real challenges there, because obviously we all know we need more trees, but we do need them in the right places. I'm particularly interested in curlew conservation, so they need big, wide open spaces, and the last thing they need is trees, because trees harbour predators, and they eat the curlews and the curlew chicks and the eggs. So the question, I suppose, is obviously we need to be moving our woodlands uphill. Sessile oak woodland takes quite a long time to mature, to get to the stage, I assume, whereby they can support the densities of caterpillars that pied flycatchers need. I don't actually know how long that is. Maybe you do. I suppose the question is, how long have we got? I know the right answer to the question is the best time to plant a tree was 100 years ago and the second best time is today. But how long have we got? Because we've kind of got to influence government and NRW and private landowners to be doing this work. So, you know, we've only got a short time to do this, to kind of model where we should be putting these trees. So I just wonder if you could say something about that and kind of where we go from here, really, in a policy context.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That you know, these decisions are being made almost in real time now, and the promises at the last election were quite enlightening and sometimes alarming. So in terms of the right trees in the right places, a lot of existing Welsh upland woodlands, of course, are on very steep slopes because that's unploughable and hard to get to for other agricultural reasons. And I suppose those very steep slopes are less used for breeding curlews and so on. So there may be places in the uplands where oak woodlands could be newly established that doesn't have a major impact on some of these very precious upland breeding wading birds, for example. In terms of when that happens, as you say, the sooner the better, and it's great to see tree planting being taken very seriously at the moment. Quite how long it takes for newly planted oak trees to become usable by these woodland birds. I think Jez is got some ideas on this. Jez, do you want to unmute?
Cheers, Rob. Hi, Julian. Yes, so Mike Shearing and I, as Rob was talking about, are actually going to start a study on this up in the, where is it, up at sort of Pennacomoyth wind farm area. We've identified some areas and we're going to do exactly this, try and find out how long it takes both the coniferous side for any species to go and occupy, but also the oak side, to find out how long it does take until the community starts building, until we start getting kind of the caterpillars, the piedflies, and also getting the sort of getting to carrying capacity level. So this is a project that's starting sort of from next year. What's going to start this year, obviously, the start of next year, and we'll hopefully soon in the next few years be able to actually answer that question.
Fantastic. That's really good. Great. I shall hound you regularly to find out the answers. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. Great. We've got.
Sorry, Rob. Hi, it's Rich. Rich Facey.
Oh,
building on Julian's comment about use, is that more about use of it being a food source or a breeding source? Because obviously they're cavity nesters, and that's something we can manage quite readily. Is it more about the oak leaves, the newly planted oak woodlands, how long they become, do they sustain enough caterpillars to support piedfly catchers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I don't particularly know the answer to this, I have to say, but certainly relatively young oaks are, you know, often full of caterpillars. So it's maybe more, as you say, a limitation in terms of breeding cavities, but then those breeding cavities can be added by adding nest boxes. So in the absence of other data, there seems little reason why relatively young oak woods couldn't be full of flycatchers and wood warblers at high altitudes in the not too distant future. Bill, I think, has a question.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering about this leaf burst time, to what extent it is genetically determined, because you were getting a high standard deviation for any one site. It wasn't necessary to look at, you know, different altitudes or latitudes. You were getting a great variance between individual oak trees. If it's genetically determined, can that help decide which genotypes should be planted in any area?
Yeah, that's a great point, and a point that I see Bob Harris has made, thanks Bob, has made in the comments as well. Potentially these genetic differences have a big effect, of course. Jez and I did a little experiment a year or two back, planting oak saplings of a uniform from a uniform source at different altitudes and latitudes, and the altitudinal effect was still detectable, even though these were all from the same stock essentially, and the latitudinal effect was detectable. So yeah, no doubt it is a mixture of genetic differences and where those trees happen to be growing. So potentially having late leafing oak stock is a very good way to ensure that the leaf burst is as late as possible for the flycatchers to be able to take advantage of, combined with planting them at relatively high latitudes and altitudes.
On the other hand, I suppose if you have a mixture of leaf burst times in a wood, that sort of buffers you against weather conditions being different from year to year.
Yeah. And with the frost damage this year, it's really striking that across a large patch of mid Wales, over the course of a couple of nights, a lot of the oak leaves were lost and killed completely. So potentially that has a big impact on local populations, at least. I think maybe Jez can fill us in here, but I think flycatchers are often quite mobile between woodlands. So potentially if they turn up and the load of the oak leaves are dead, they can quite quickly shift over to another oak woodland. Is that so, Jez?
Yes, yeah, they can move certainly a few K. And so, yes, as you say, the variation within a wood and within a tree is such that, yeah, they don't have to go very far before they've managed to go from the earliest possible leaf to the latest possible leaf within a few kilometres.
Great. Another thing that's worth saying, picking up on another of Bob Harris's comments here, is that although we always talk about flycatchers in oak trees, they do live in other kinds of woodland as well. And Bob's saying in older riverside regions of Shropshire, what's likely to happen there. And I think we're so fixated almost on the oak woodlands caterpillar story, we often sort of forget that flycatchers actually, they do live in other habitats, and they don't only eat caterpillars either. And Jez and others have been looking at some of the dietary variation as well in flycatchers. So although I've painted this picture of caterpillars being the only thing to think about, actually we do need to think about other parts of the diet as well. Jez, do you want to just outline what the diet is?
Yeah, cheers. So predominantly, as you say, the kind of chick rearing sort of 7 to 12 days, it's very heavily caterpillar skewed. But earlier in the season, they're looking sort of spiders, other arachnids form sort of a large part of the early nestling diet, and also sort of coleoptera and other kind of beetles are also kind of a large proportion of the adult diet as well earlier in the season. So we need kind of this complex mix of individuals between what the whole community needs to function, basically, obviously. So that you've got, the beetles, the spiders, and the caterpillars at the right sort of times.
Great, thank you, Jez. Excellent. Frank, it's 1/4 past.
Can I maybe ask another question?
Oh, yeah, go for it. Hi, Baron.
Hi, Rob. You're basically focusing on the population of the oaks in related to the bird numbers. You don't really mention about the composition of the actual caterpillars. I can't imagine, although you draw a nice caterpillar, very famous to all of us when we I can imagine that the caterpillar composition is highly variable. Is anything known about caterpillar composition as such? And also, related to that, there's a big decline because it's not only about caterpillars, in butterfly composition in this country.
Mm-hmm.
How does that all add up towards the whole hypothesis that the presence of your oak trees is important for the return of your birds?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Berend. It's certainly the case that the diet is, relatively broad, as Jez is saying. That's although the trophic mismatch story has been very focused on the winter moth caterpillars, which are certainly a big part of what flycatchers are eating in the Netherlands populations, which is where this mismatch idea originally came from. At least in mid Wales, the woodlands are full of lots of different caterpillar species, and it would be very surprising, I think, if the birds weren't exploiting that wide diversity of caterpillars and, as Jet says, a wide range of other taxa as needed nutritionally as well. So I think, yeah, these are fairly unexplored details of the system. And what we're measuring, for example, with caterpillar frass, caterpillar poo, is just a very broad brush. What is the biomass of the caterpillars and how is that changing over time? But I think, yeah, there's endless details to look into as to what is that biomass composed of, and how is that dependent on temperatures and so on.
Thank you.
And Dave Carrington has got a really nice question here. What about the flycatchers changing? Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I think certainly we've seen flycatchers, nesting now about 10 days earlier than they did in the 1970s. And over time, of course, that creates selection pressure on birds to evolve, new behaviours, as well as behavioural flexibility, changing the timing of when they're doing things. But it seems that for a lot of these long distance migrants from Africa, everything is constrained by the timing of departure from Africa, which is determined largely by day length cues, which are nothing to do with climate. And so there seems to be this real kind of mechanistic constraint on how rapidly flycatchers can evolve an earlier migration time. And that seems to be part of the explanation of why flycatchers have failed to keep track of the pace of changes in the timing of spring in the UK, because a lot of their biology is so determined by what goes on in Africa. Great. I'm slightly aware of the time now. So, Frank, is that time to finish up, do you think?
Yes, I think so. I was just going to say, I think also you're to keep a less strain on your voice. I think there are lots of interesting additional questions. Just one thing maybe is worth flagging. Where will the recording be posted? Is that clear already? Will that be on YouTube, did you think?
Good question, in that I believe it must be possible to post this on YouTube and then I'll share a link. In practice, I haven't done that from Zoom, so I think we'll try it and see.
So I think what we can say is that Rob and I will tweet about it. So if you look at our Twitter feeds, that should give you the information then.
Yeah. That's great. So, Frank, do you want to type in your Twitter? There we go.
Yes.
Brilliant. So thanks everybody for coming along and really interesting questions, and thanks for a great discussion. And just as we go, quick congratulations to Sophie Lee Williams, who's led this new publication just out today. Or bizarrely, it was published at midnight last night, not sure why, but it's our new paper on the distribution of golden and white-tailed eagles, historic distribution in Wales. So I'll post that link if anybody fancies a read of Sophie's great triumph. She's about to submit her PhD thesis, and this is the first paper from that. So congratulations to Sophie as well.
Okay, but I think with that also a big thank you to Rob for a really interesting talk. And also I think really nice to see how you sort of included everyone who's contributed to this and how a multi-person effort this really is. So really exciting to see more things come out of that. And then thank you all for attending and listening and for the great questions.
I realized that I failed to show the acknowledgement slide, which perhaps is very important. So I don't know if you can see this, but these are my thanks, my apologies, and ways to keep in touch with the project.
That's brilliant. Okay, then we'll end it here. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Rob. Bye-bye. Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.